Okay, good afternoon. I am Pat Swan. I have had the great opportunity to be a senior program officer at New York Community Trust for the past 16, going on 17 years. I also have the very distinct pleasure of serving on the board of Philanthropy New York. And I'm so proud of the program so far today. Has just been amazing. So I congratulate Philanthropy New York. I'm not going to name everybody as Brandy did. I've been asked to introduce the next Phil Talk. The theme is Census 2020 is a civic engagement opportunity. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to try and frame the conversation or set the stage a little bit by talking a little bit about an organization in formation that I've had the opportunity to be a part of. About this time last year, a small group of funders came together to basically create a learning community about Census 2020. So we learned a lot about the very particular challenges of this census, and we talked a lot about the role of philanthropy in trying to ensure an accurate and fair census. Eventually, that group evolved into a more formal entity, which is described on page 14 of your annual meeting program, called the New York State Grantmakers for Census Equity. And we are creating this as a vehicle for funders to coordinate the allocation of resources statewide to ensure a fair and accurate census. We hope to be, we hope to be operational by early 2019. And in the program on page 14, you will see contact information to follow up. If you're at all interested, we certainly invite and encourage any and all interested funders to be a part of this group. And so having been given the opportunity to make that small pitch, I'm now going to introduce someone who knows exactly why the consequences of an inaccurate count in this coming census are so dire, and who understands the very special and unique challenges that we face in Census 2020, but who also recognizes the opportunity for various constituencies and sectors to come together, including the philanthropic sector, government, and the nonprofit sector. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Choi, who is the president of the New York Immigration Coalition, executive director of New York Immigration Coalition.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much to Philanthropy New York for inviting me to speak on this critical topic. I am going to start by taking us back to 2010. 2010, when BlackBerrys were still a thing. Remember those? When Mark Zuckerberg was Time Magazine's Man of the Year, and he was still smiling. And when 6 million people would tune in and day out to watch Michael, the Situation Sorrentino, on the Jersey Shore. This was 2010. But organizers like myself were working on a different problem. We were talking about Census 2010. And so Census 2010, well, first of all, the census is supposed to count the country's entire population. And it's supposed to do so every single 10 years. And it's been doing so since 1790, when we had Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. This happens every 10 years. So I want to fast forward to 2018. BlackBerrys are dead, long live the iPad. Mark Zuckerberg is not smiling anymore. And the situation finds himself in a very unpleasant situation right now. And so we are only 2 years away, though, from Census 2020, which could be the most critical moment in our lifetimes. And let me just tell you this about Census 2020. We are in bad shape when it comes to Census 2020. Let me tell you exactly the reasons why Census 2020 is going to be different from that in 2010. They're trying to make it an online census. That means that instead of filling out a paper form, they want folks to go online and fill out an online survey form. The questions in my mind are already sort of spinning. What are they going to do about poor communities, rural residents, people who are on the wrong side of the digital divide, who don't have access to safe and secure internet? And thinking about data security, what are they going to do to make sure that all that information being gathered up in millions of different networks and being transmitted up to the Bureau, how are they going to keep that safe and secure? That's a key issue. Let me tell you something. In 1993, Congress passed a law, the 1993 Statistics Act, and it said that all census data confidentiality would be guaranteed, and that those statistics would only be used for statistical purposes, all that data. Let me tell you something. If you believe that, I have a Trump University course ready to sell you. Guaranteed success. The Census Bureau has a bad record when it comes to data protection. 15 years ago, the Census Bureau gave information about Muslim and Middle Eastern neighborhoods to DHS for the Special Registration Program. Tens of thousands of immigrants were actually deported as a result. So these questions of data protection and security are far from being answered. The Census Bureau is not yet ready for prime time. The Bureau's budget is being threatened. They don't even have a Bureau director. It's being vacant. And the thousands of canvassers, the field folks, who are supposed to go and count every single person, that army of canvassers is going to get slashed in half because it is an online census. Here's another way of thinking about it. The Bureau has already supposed to have finished 3 full end-to-end experiments on the census with the new online form, with the new citizenship question. They've done 1 in Providence, Rhode Island. How did that go? The Providence mayor said, at best, gross incompetence. So the Census Bureau is not yet ready for prime time. We need to understand that. Finally, this is the big elephant in the room. There may, as you know, be just a little bit more fear, particularly in immigrant communities, of the federal government than there was 10 years ago. The citizenship question that was just recently introduced, that's nothing but a scare tactic designed to stop thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of people from participating. And you take the fear that so many different communities have about giving their information and giving it to the federal government, multiply that by magnitudes, that is the situation that we face today. And so the prevailing view of Census 2020 can be summed up in one word, and that is scary. Oops. But I'm an optimist, and I'm going to take the glass half full approach. Because I actually think that Census 2020 can be an opportunity instead of an obstacle, a boon instead of a barrier. And the reason why, the reason for my optimism, my guarded optimism, is rooted in my experiences 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a lot has changed in 10 years, including my hairstyle. The hair of my youth. Back then, I was the executive director of the Min Kwan Center for Community Action. It's a grassroots organization working with the Asian American community in Flushing, Queens. But I learned then how the census can actually be made to work for vibrant communities like ours. So the national average response rate for the census is about 67%. But in communities with a lot of immigrants, with a lot of minorities, that number is about 25%. And so that's got huge implications and consequences, because if you're not counted in the census, you don't exist. And if you don't exist, then that's a real problem, because you don't get money. And that's actually one thing that the census is about. It is about money. There's $400 billion of federal funding that is actually allocated depending on the census results. $53 billion in New York State. So every single person who is not counted, that's a loss of more than $1,000 in federal funding for their community and for their district. And that is for schools, it's for transportation, it's for services. And think about how that adds up for hard-to-count districts who often need those services the most. So armed with that knowledge, we went out into the community. And we said we need to overcome the lack of language access, the fear of giving information to the government, a lack of understanding what the census was about. And how did we solve that? We went door to door. We pounded on the pavement. We knocked on doors. We spoke to residents in the languages that they were comfortable, in Korean, in Chinese, and Spanish. And people took notice. The New York Times actually wrote a feature article about this, and they immediately homed in on our secret weapon. We had bags and bags of freebies, of free can openers and pens. Yes, my first ever quote in the New York Times was sadly not about democracy. It was about freebies. It was about can openers and pens. Yes, I will never live that down. But it's also not just about money and federal funding. It is also about political power. Because the census directly informs the way in which city and state and federal districts are drawn. And so if you get the count right, then the numbers are apparent and communities are kept together and they must be represented and their political power grows. And that is exactly what happened in 2010 in Queens. Because we made sure that in our core districts, we doubled the response rate in our core districts in Queens. So many Asian American community members were counted that the districts had to reflect what they look like now. And so before the census was able to inform redistricting, there was one single Asian American majority district in the state assembly, one. But after the 2010 census, when they drew the lines again on the state level, we had 2 Asian American assembly districts in Queens, one more in Brooklyn, the first ever Asian majority state Senate district in the history of New York State, and the first ever Asian plurality congressional district in New York State as well. And what did that mean? It's not a coincidence that the woman who represented that Asian American state assembly district, she saw the opportunity. And she ran for that new Asian plurality congressional district. She ran for Congress, and she won, and she became the first ever Asian American congresswoman elected from the state of New York, Grace Meng. Grace Meng continues to be a staunch ally for immigrants, and it is only fitting that she is one of our champions on the 2020 census as well. Folks, this is the opportunity in a nutshell that we can politically empower communities in the long run. It's not just about money, it's also about political power. But we can't just do this in Queens. And we can't just do this in a couple areas. We need to do this in all of New York State. Because we still had an undercount in New York State in 2010. And as a result, we lost dollars and we lost 2 congressional seats. Who got those seats? Who got that funding? Georgia, Florida, Texas, Utah. The list goes on. You think New York couldn't use those congressional votes right about now? I guarantee you they could. So we've got our work cut out for us. In 2020, in Census 2020, we've got to do a couple of things. I'm going to focus in on a couple key things. First of all, we need to use data and technology in the right kind of way. Back then, in 2010, we didn't have much in the way of technology. The first iPad had actually never been invented by the time Census Day 2010 rolled around. But if we do this right, if we use data and technology combined with a massive ground effort, think about that. We can actually make sure that an online census can actually expand participation, not restrict it. Think about it. If we have armies of street teams that are connected with web tablets, going and helping folks fill out the survey right there and then, and we're able to solve the issues of data protection confidentiality, we're able to make big data work for us instead of the other way around. And we can actually make sure that we get an extra degree of confidentiality guaranteed. That is the fight that we need to have. But if we use data and technology right, with the kind of ground effort that we need, no doubt in my mind this can be a game changer in 2020. But we got to do it in a smart fashion. We need to get state and local governments involved. The federal government's incompetence, folly, ideology, you can pick your noun, it means that state and local governments need to get into the game. And the fascinating thing is that a lot of these state and local governments may be hostile to immigrants. They don't like communities of color very much. And they're not really thinking about underserved communities, but this is one opportunity where they need all those folks to get the federal funding that they recognize as important. This is an opportunity, and we've got to encourage these kinds of unlikely partnerships. There is an opportunity here. And then finally, our ace in the hole is that we are more organized than we ever have been in before. In 2010, there was no statewide coalition. But this time around, the New York Immigration Coalition, we have member agencies like the Minkwon Center. We have electeds like Grace Meng. We have more than 50 partner agencies who have come together to create a statewide coalition, New York Counts 2020. And the goal of this is not just to reach immigrant communities. It's to reach out to African American communities, rural residents upstate. We're going to cross different ideological lines. We can bring together folks on both sides of the urban and rural divide. We can bring together business and labor, tenants' rights groups and developers who are all working together because they have a shared interest in one common goal. And that is to make sure that every single New Yorker is counted. Friends, that is the opportunity that we see today. If we can get so many different folks at a time where our country and state is so polarized, the opportunity to bring people together, to civically engage everyone in a way that we're all pulling towards one common goal, this, I think, is the real long-term opportunity. So, beyond money and power, that, I think, is the greatest opportunity of all, to come together as one for one common goal. With the right strategy and the right resources, I think Census 2020 can be an incredible catalyst for change. And that, I think, is the kind of situation we can all root for. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for laying out the challenges, but also the opportunities and the importance of Census 2020. I also want to thank Pat Swan for her work, along with her colleagues, for rallying the funding community with the New York State Grantmakers for Census Equity.